Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Geoffrey Wawro. I was hoping I said that right. And we are going to discuss the Vietnam War. He recently published late last year a brilliant book on the Vietnam and military history. And that is what we are going to discuss today. We also did another episode with Mark Lawrence on Vietnam, which I highly would recommend checking out. So what made you want to, let's begin with what was it about this book that was intriguing to you? And it's you really dig into the Vietnam War with the in the dark side of the war as well. But what was it about this book that inspired you to write it?
Well, I mean, I grew up in the 1960s and 70s, so as a little boy, I was exposed to this war through, the news coverage on television. This was the first living room war, where you would walk into your house and the evening news would be on, and there would be video clips from Vietnam, from real firefights. I was impressed by that, and it was in every. I was a paper boy, and I'd like go down and I'd cut the little cord on my bundle of newspapers, and there on the front page would be news from Vietnam. My parents would, had subscriptions to Time, Newsweek, Life, even Paris Match. So I was exposed to Vietnam everywhere. And as a budding historian, even as a child, I took a great interest in it. I kind of carried that interest around with me my whole life. And then, I was writing books about other things, always to do with military history. But one of the books I always wanted to write was on Vietnam. But I didn't get to it until now. And it was in some ways it was fortunate because so much has been declassified, that wasn't declassified earlier. So when I went in 2018, 2019, 2020, doing the research for this book in the archives, there was a lot more stuff that had been just routinely declassified than would have been available to earlier historians. So this gave me the opportunity to really put myself in the shoes of the people that were running this war and see what information they had and if it supported the decisions they made. And what I found was that it usually did not support the decisions they made. They knew it didn't, but they did it anyway.
So let's begin. And I want to begin with the French leaving Vietnam because it was quite a mess what they left behind. And actually before, so let's talk a bit about how they dividing of North and South. I was about to say Korea, but it's Vietnam and generally. So let's talk about the dividing of South and North Vietnam and had the French leaving as a colonial power.
Well, I mean, that was our opportunity, the American opportunity to pursue the policy that we had been committed to during World War II, which was decolonization. That had been a prime objective of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had said that we're not fighting this war of United Nations against fascism in order to prolong the life of European colonial empires after the war. But he dies in the last month of the war in Europe and is replaced by his vice president, Harry Truman, who takes a far more utilitarian approach to the conflict and says, well, you know what, colonialism is wrong, but communism is worse. So we're going to back these colonial regimes that are trying to return to their old haunts in the hope that they will form a wall against the spread of communism. And so in this way, we end up paying 80 to 90% of the costs of the French war effort in Indochina between 1946 and 1954 when they pull out. And then after 1954, we take over 100%, paying for the old puppet army they had set up, which becomes the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, as well as the South Vietnamese government.
It's kind of crazy to think that it started in the age of Eisenhower and end in the time of Nixon. You have 4 to 5 different presidents in that span of the Vietnam War. And we're going to jump back to Nixon, of course, but it's kind of crazy how the amount of time this war took.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was yes, because it was one of these wars where the with the North Vietnamese who were backing the Vietcong, initially the Viet Minh, and then renamed by the South Vietnamese government the Vietcong, the Vietnamese commies. They were pursuing a Maoist strategy of biding their time, building up strength on the periphery in rural, safe areas, building up base areas, and then spreading their influence through an inkblot strategy of spreading these sanctuaries outward into the surrounding countryside, and then building up strength, tax revenues, weapons, and manpower, and then striking opportunistically until they achieved a level of force where they could then take on regular trained and equipped forces. So that's it's those kind of conflicts always take a long time, which is why a Western strategist like Basil Liddell Hart, in his great book Strategy, talked about how it's just it's very difficult for Western democracies, affluent Western democracies, to fight these wars because they take forever and they're inconclusive, and they kind of flare up and then they die down, but they go on and on and on. And so Western democracies that want closure can't handle it, and the communists in the developing world were well aware of this dynamic. So their whole strategy was just to prolong the war and its costs to such an extent that first France and then the United States would tire of the conflict and just go away.
So it was kind of a Great War strategy where the hope was to exhaust the enemy entrenched, except it's guerrilla warfare, kind of like the Great War where they hope to exhaust the enemy first, in a way like the strategy of the Great War.
Yeah, but the Great War is more like industrial powers.
Yeah, I mean, just doing the comparison.
Right. Whereas this is more a game of it's more a shadowy game of whack-a-mole, where the guerrillas keep retreating into sanctuaries and sort of daring the Western forces to come in and find them, and then inflicting heavy casualties with mines and booby traps and ambushes, and then disappearing again, and just making it impossible to politically control the country or militarily.
So let's talk. I want to ask, I don't know if this is a silly question, but I do want to do a bit comparison again to, say, for example, the Korean War. What would be the difference between the Korean War and the Vietnam War? Because I'd really say this probably sounds a little silly again, but they kind of feel a bit the same, also very different, but also kind of the same theme. You have the communism versus capitalism, and you also have the North versus South, just in a different part of Eurasia. So, what would be the biggest difference if there was between this war and the Korean War?
Well, terrain. It was far easier for the Americans to operate with all their firepower in Korea because it wasn't jungled, and it was easier to kind of control and maneuver in and to bomb, right? But they were similar, and also in Korea you don't have, it's a peninsula like Indochina, but Vietnam is just one piece of that peninsula. So you've got these big neutral sanctuaries on the western border of South Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos, right? They're technically neutral, but they're sanctuaries for communist forces coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So, and you don't have that dynamic in Korea. So, the only place the North Koreans and their Chinese sponsor can go is north into China. They can't flee to west or east because they're going to be in the ocean, right? So the whole war is confined to that peninsula. Even so, it bogs down into an interminable war of attrition that is only ended in 1953 when Eisenhower threatens, nuclear weapons, right? So it had the potential to become a long quagmire such as Vietnam, but because we had that monopoly on nuclear weapons vis-a-vis the Chinese, and we were able to make that threat with some credibility, we were able to terminate the war, but just barely. And so that's the nightmare that's on everyone's mind in Vietnam, because by then the Chinese are a nuclear armed power. They're much more confident. They're in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. They're sort of like all jazzed up about communism and showing that they're the power of progress in the modern age. And so it's never clear that they're not going to intervene in this war, and they're constantly threatening to intervene in this war. And they're not only grouped north of North Vietnam on the Chinese border with North Vietnam, but they've also got an estimated 100,000 troops in Laos during the war, basically running, helping to run the Ho Chi Minh Trail through Laos. And they've also claim to sort of they sort of sponsor Cambodia as well. So any American incursion, deep incursion into Cambodia would probably spark a Chinese intervention as well. So in both cases, Korea and in Vietnam, the United States has to be deeply concerned about the prospects of a Chinese intervention that would make the war, much longer, much harder to terminate.
Before we go back to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, I want to talk a little bit about training the ARVN troops and the morality of the ARVN troops versus, say, the communist troops and what the process there.
Well, I mean, the ARVN troops are pretty thoroughly demoralized throughout the war. They have conscription is implemented haltingly and reluctantly by the various juntas that succeed after the coup against Diem in 1963. There's a sequence of three juntas that then culminate in the Chu Ki junta in 1966 that lasts until 1975. And all of these governments are averse to having a conscription law for the same reason like Putin doesn't want to have a mobilization law in Russia today, because it's going to anger all the families, and all the sort of middle class sons don't want to go into the military. So it's much easier to kind of go into the villages and just grab peasants, right, and press them into the ranks. But the peasants are under no illusion that this is a patriotic war. They feel like they're being put upon. And the desertion rate in the ARVN is very high. 20 per thousand every month of the war. 20 out of every 1,000 ARVN conscripts is deserting. And when U.S. and ARVN forces go on patrols in VC held territory, they find a lot of young men they assume are VC. Many of them are just ARVN deserters, right? So it's very hard to distinguish who's an ARVN deserter and who's an actual Vietcong guerrilla. So and the thing about the ARVN, very, very poorly funded, pay is low, and they're so poor that they have to bring their dependents with them to the army camp. So, for example, if you're a conscript in the ARVN, a private soldier in the ARVN, and you're married and you have kids, you bring your wife and kids to the army post where you're established, and then when you go out on patrol, you leave your kids and your wife alone, unprotected, back at the base, right? So that's another reason why they talk about how the ARVN patrols were they don't go out on long ops like the Americans, who will go into the bush for 30 days at a time, because they don't want to leave their wife and kids exposed to communist reprisals while they're away. So
some of the ARVN troops actually help the Vietcong as well, right? They kind of took bribes and they help. I don't know how open this was, but some of them helped the Vietcong as well.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, there were plenty of VC penetration agents inside the ARVN combat division. So there were lots of VC in the ARVN. There were a lot of times you would have VC that would come over in the Chu Hoi program, which was the open arms amnesty program. If you're a VC, you could come in and say, "I'm coming in from the cold." A lot of times they'd put you into the ARVN, right? So there were opportunities for the VC to get their own guys into the ARVN, which they did, and they'd be spying on the ARVN. And all the ARVN staffs, all the ARVN headquarters had uniformed officers who were VC spies, right? So the ARVN was thoroughly penetrated during the war, which added to that note of demoralization.
So you mentioned the Ho Chi Minh Trail earlier, obviously named after Ho Chi Minh himself. So what was the Ho Chi Minh Trail? I mean, it's kind of just, I assume people have a certain idea of what it was, but elaborate a little further on the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Yeah, Ho Chi Minh Trail refers to, basically in 1954, when the Geneva Conference was held and the French pulled out of Indochina. And as regards Vietnam, the solution was to divide Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Everything north would be North Vietnam, capital Hanoi, communist run. Everything south would be, of the 17th parallel, would be South Vietnam, a Western-backed, fledgling democratic country. And but the problem is that running alongside South Vietnam were the neutral countries of Laos and Cambodia. So it was fairly easy to block North Vietnamese infiltration of troops and supplies across the DMZ, that little that border at the 17th parallel, because it was heavily fortified. You had U.S. Marines on heights overlooking the DMZ. They were looking for any sign of infiltration. So what do the North Vietnamese do? They go around the DMZ. They go through Laos and Cambodia, and they infiltrate into South Vietnam. Other places. Either they come in just below it in the northern part of South Vietnam, or they go about halfway down and they come in through the Central Highlands. Or they go all the way down into Cambodia and they come in through the Mekong Delta. So there's various marches you can take to get in of varying lengths. About all in all, the Ho Chi Minh Trail is about 9,000 miles of paths, roads, waterways, all flowing north south, and these would carry these North Vietnamese troops. These would be infiltrators coming in to replace casualties among the Vietcong, the guerrillas recruited in the south, but also supplies. By 1968, the North Vietnamese are moving 10,000 tons of supplies a month down this Ho Chi Minh Trail, which again is a improvised trail made up of these 9,000 odd miles of paths, tracks, roads, waterways flowing down parallel to the border of South Vietnam in the neutral countries of Laos and Cambodia. So trying to interdict this supply line was always a big American effort. Laos was the most heavily bombed country in the history of world history. I mean, the Americans bombed Laos so much, the eastern part of Laos, abutting South Vietnam, trying to hit the trail, trying to close the trail, never successful, because the North Vietnamese they had this permanent force, a military transport group with thousands of laborers that were engaged in Laos and Cambodia, constantly repairing the trail, upgrading the trail, making bypasses around bomb craters so that the stuff could keep moving. And then, of course, they would infiltrate the troops in small parties of men that were pretty impervious to airstrikes, because they were silent. They'd move at night. They'd move under triple canopy jungle cover, and it was very hard to target them. So they kept it going. And the whole this fantasy. There's a kind of revisionist fantasy about this war that we could have won by cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and there's just no way to cut it because, as I said, 9,000 odd miles of roads, tracks, trails, waterways. Every time one shut down, they just open another one alongside it, right? And then they fixed the one that's been shut down and get that one going as well. And one thing I noted in the book, which I hadn't seen highlighted anywhere else, was that one of the prime arteries of the Ho Chi Minh Trail was inside South Vietnam. It's the A Shau Valley. If you go to Vietnam today, you go all the way over to the west near the border with Laos, near the hallowed spot of Khe Sanh, the old Marine combat base, and that's the A Shau Valley. And one of the most notorious battles of the war was fought there in 1969, the Battle of Hamburger Hill. And this was one of the last attempts by the Americans to take and hold the A Shau Valley, and we suffered major casualties. It was a huge black eye for the Nixon administration. It forced the Nixon administration to accelerate Vietnamization, accelerate the de-Americanization of the war because of the casualties at Hamburger Hill, because it was so heavily defended, and the communists were not going to get out of the A Shau Valley. This was the fastest way for them to supply their forces in South Vietnam, and they weren't going to give it up, and we never took it from them. And that was inside South Vietnam. So then you say, well, then how are we going to take the ones that were in Laos and Cambodia if we couldn't even take the one that was in South Vietnam?
Now, before we go into the South Vietnamese government, I want to ask, what made the Vietcong such competent fighters? I mean, we kind of already touched about this with the low pay and low morale in the ARVN troops, but what made the Vietcong such motivated and fierce fighters compared to the South, who needed constantly help from the Americans if they were to go anywhere?
Well, it's not hard to understand that. Imagine when they drove out the French between 1946 and 54. They came in. They'd been the Viet Minh force. This was the nationalist force led by Ho Chi Minh that had battled against the Vichy French collaborators and the Japanese in World War II. They'd received OSS American support to fight the Japanese and their French collaborator allies in Indochina during the war. They were supplied by the Americans in part. And then they fought this heroic struggle against the French. 1946 to 54, the French had all the advantages of technology and money and American support, and sort of professional Western-led forces against this, quote unquote ragtag guerrilla army. But the ragtag guerrilla army was brave. It was technically competent, and it surprised the French over and over, and then ultimately drove them out in the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. So they were legendary. These people were celebrities all over Vietnam. They were heroes. They had reclaimed Vienna from the French colonial overseers. So in comes this new government, Ngo Dinh Diem, who was stood up by the French and by and was the prime minister to a puppet monarch created by the French, and then he's inherited by the Americans. The Americans see him. He wasn't really pro-French, so the Americans see him as someone whose hands are not contaminated by the French or by the communists. But to the Vietnamese people, he doesn't have the luster of Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was the one who led the liberation struggle against the French. Ho Chi Minh was the one who lived in the mountains, lived in the jungles, who padded around in sandals and shared in all the rigors of the campaign with the troops. And whereas Ngo Dinh Diem is this very elitist Roman Catholic bigot, and who lives in the presidential palace, always goes around in his white sharkskin suit, very aloof. He's very Confucian. Thinks he's sort of the Mandarin who everybody has to respect, and nothing like the common touch and the charisma of a Ho Chi Minh. So he's the one who comes up with the name Vietcong, Vietnamese commie for the Viet Minh fighters. But to the actual, there are Western journalists circulating in South Vietnam in the early years, in the 50s and the early 60s, and they talk to peasants, and they say, why and they say, why are you calling these guys Viet Minh? And they go, they're the Viet Minh. He goes, no, they're the Viet Cong. They go, what's Viet Cong? So in other words, Viet Cong, it doesn't even register with the Vietnamese people until much later, after a decade of use. But initially, it's just an attempt by Diem to rebrand the heroic Viet Minh as something worse, but they're the same fighters. In their minds, they're fighting for the same thing: national unification under a Vietnamese regime, not a bifurcated country with a northern communist zone and a southern zone run by foreign puppets.
So let's talk about the Vietnamese government, and it's much, again, I'm doing a comparison to Korea, but at least in the early years, and not what it would later become, of course, but it was not quite a competent government the South Vietnamese had to deal with.
You mean the South Vietnamese government?
The South Vietnamese government, yeah.
Well, they had a lot of disadvantages. Let's face it, it's a lot easier to be an authoritarian communist government that brooks no resistance and no opposition than it is to be a functioning democracy. So, so that's why Diem is technically democratically elected, first as prime minister, then as president, but he engages in rampant vote rigging. And then he's overthrown by a military coup, which is the antithesis of democratic, right? Mm. And then the coup governments govern in an authoritarian way, saying we have no choice. We're fighting a civil war.
That's the key government, right? That's the key government, right?
Well, there's a number of them. There's Big Min's government overthrows Diem in 1963. Then there's the Khan government in 1964. Then there's another one in 1965, and then there's Chu and Key in 1966, right? And they last until 1975. And so the Johnson administration is constantly pressing these guys to kind of liberalize and hold elections, and they do eventually hold elections, but the elections are also gerrymandered and rigged, and to get the right results. And
ironically, it's kind of communist elections in a way.
Oh, absolutely, they are, and you can see why, because they're having a civil war, and and out in the and there's whole areas that there's no voting in because they're controlled by the Vietcong. Remember, the Vietcong throughout the Vietnam War, they control like 80% of the hamlets, of the rural hamlets, right? So the people that are voting are the few hamlets that are under government control and the cities, right? So big tracts, a quarter of the population are probably unreachable because of Viet Cong control and terrorism. So there's not a lot to choose from in terms of the two regimes. They're both extremely authoritarian. The communists far more authoritarian, and but so there's no real way for democracy as a concept or as a freedom to be felt in South Vietnam, because all the governments, even the ones that are democratically elected, like Chu after 1968, they're forced to constantly clamp down on the press, clamp down on public demonstrations, clamp down on anti-war protests, clamp down on mobilization protests. So they're both but in the North, it's far more so. I mean, nobody even dares, you can protest in South Vietnam. You can't protest in North Vietnam. So that also contributes to the power of the North Vietnamese, because this total control of the Politburo by Ly Duan, who kind of pushes Ho Chi Minh out of the picture in the mid to late 1960s, and takes total control of the Politburo and of the security apparatus, means that he's able to wage this incredibly difficult, bloody war, where the casualties are really high, but also the misery at home is high, because the U.S. is bombing North Vietnam from 1965 to 1968 and knocking out all the infrastructure, making it very hard to move goods around the country, and knocking out all the power generation. So you're having constant brownouts and blackouts. So it's a really miserable life, short rations and very uncomfortable in the North throughout the war. But because the communists are a really severe authoritarian system, they get away with it in a way that they are able to enforce the kind of misery that could not be enforced in the South.
So what about the American influence on, because obviously there was quite a bit American influence in the South Vietnamese government. So let's talk about this American influence on the government.
Well, I mean, the American influence is, it's enforced through a sequence of ambassadors, who aren't particularly good, in terms of really knowing the country and empathizing, sympathizing with the country, and they're much more about making South Vietnam do whatever the White House wants it to do. Whether we're talking about Lodge or Bunker or Nolting or Graham Martin, it's they all tend to sort of try to enforce whatever the president's trying to accomplish, on the argument that, hey, we're giving you all this stuff, so you need to do what we want you to do. And so that ends up striking the Vietnamese as very humiliating, and makes them feel like they're in a very subordinate position, and that they're sort of serving as American cannon fodder. And so there's the relationship between the United States and South Vietnam is always, very difficult, very fraught for these reasons. And also because the Americans have by 1967, 68, they've got 500,000 troops in country, about 70,000 of which are in combat, right, and taking heavy casualties. Like in 1968, 200 Americans are dying every week in South Vietnam. So so the American press starts to compare the casualty list and sees that more American soldiers are dying in South Vietnam than South Vietnamese soldiers, and this is also a real irritant, but it's viewed by the South Vietnamese as yet another attempt by the Americans to put us down, right? So the relationship is never smooth, as it never is in these kind of things. Just look at the recently concluded war in Afghanistan and the really fraught relations between the U.S. and the Afghan national government. That was never easy either. There's always this feeling that we were making them a pawn of ours, and they didn't like that, but we didn't like that they weren't grateful to us, and blah, blah. This is what you always get when you fight these kind of wars.
So I think it's time to talk about American soldiers and conscription of American soldiers into Vietnam. and how the process and of say from early until later when the war escalated, because they are, from what I understand from your book, they were quite careful with having the soldiers on the ground because they didn't want to make it an American war, from what I understand. And I may be mistaken, but they had just a few couple thousand, maybe not 10,000 troops, something in the early years before they really started to conscript the to troops to South Vietnam. So let's talk a little bit about conscription and troops into the into Vietnam.
Well, I mean, the plan was initially to do it. Eisenhower and Kennedy wanted to do it with advisors only. They never wanted to commit American forces because that would Americanize the war. It would make the war America's problem. And both Eisenhower and Kennedy had big doubts about the staying power of the South Vietnamese regime under Ngo Dinh Diem. And then Kennedy was there when the coup happened, so Kennedy had the same doubts about the coup government that followed. So neither one of those presidents wanted to put in U.S. forces, but it was just the situation was getting worse and worse as the Vietcong grew in number and the North Vietnamese infiltrated more agents and more weapons and supplies into South Vietnam to kind of grow the VC movement. So under Kennedy, you go from a few hundred advisors at the beginning of his term to 15,000 advisors when he's assassinated in November '63. So he had already, but still, he was. You had American pilots that were flying missions, but he wasn't putting ground troops into combat because he didn't want to really tether the United States to this war in a permanent way. He wanted to have a really light footprint where the U.S. could say, "Look, we did our best, and these guys can't do it, so we're not going to put American boys in there to do what they can't do themselves." That was kind of the Kennedy view. We don't know if Kennedy would have escalated beyond that because he was assassinated. But when Johnson comes in, he says, "Look."
Well, what are your thoughts there? If Kennedy had lived, and there's several books that kind of theorizing alternative history. Stephen King wrote one, but what do you think had Kennedy lived, how the escalation would have gone in Vietnam? You think it would have been much different from, say, Lyndon B. Johnson? Did he just
So.
follow the policy of JFK when he took over, or was there difference between the two men? How do you think the war would have escalated?
Well, I mean, when you say the policy of JFK, the policy of JFK is probably best understood by that great book by David Halberstam, The Best and the Brightest. If you read that book, it's clear that the policy of JFK was to be as devious and ambiguous and ambivalent as possible. JFK hated the war in Vietnam. JFK wanted to kind of cloud the war in Vietnam in as much mystery as possible to give the appearance of fighting it to appease hawks and to kind of steal the thunder of the American right, people like Republican Senator Barry Goldwater or Republican Governor Ronald Reagan, who wanted to go in and bomb North Vietnam back into the Stone Age and put in lots of troops and win the war. Kennedy saw that was a total loser because A, it was expensive, B, it probably wouldn't work, C, it would absorb his entire presidency fighting this war in a very peripheral area. But there was like real pressure from hawks to do more, right? So that's why Kennedy just kind of clouds it and builds up the advisors and talks about how they're winning, even though he knows they're not winning. So then when he dies, you say the Kennedy policy. The Kennedy policy, I believe he would not have inserted ground troops. He would have kept along this trajectory of advisors, money, weapons, and then once he was reelected to a second term in 1964, I think he would have tried to back out of Vietnam. That's how I see it. But of course, we don't know. Johnson comes in and says, "Look, America's rich, North Vietnam's poor, China's poor. We can win this war. And he's advised by some people like Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and Secretary of State Dean Rusk and National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, all of whom tell him that, look, we don't need to go fight like a big war against them. They're a raggedy ass fourth rate little country, as Johnson said. We could just fight them with just a fraction of our armed forces, and we'll still bloody them so much that they'll just give up.
As we discussed earlier, that was certainly not the case.
Yeah, so it was based on a total misunderstanding of the nature of the North Vietnamese regime, the nature of the war that they were embarked on. They were fighting an unlimited war for national unification and for the communization of the entire Indo-Chinese peninsula, right? So they weren't going to stop at the 17th parallel. They were going to keep pressing south, and they were going to absorb whatever punishment they had to in order to win this war. So there was this sort of, in the Johnson White House, they were thinking that the North Vietnamese would think like Americans. Well, if we raise the level of pain to this level, they'll stop, right? And they didn't realize that, no, this is a regime that knows no limits because they have total control of the population through the communist security apparatus. They can enforce obedience. They can enforce conscription. They can send as many troops as they want. I mean, the Americans fixated on body count as a way of winning this war, but the body count in North Vietnam was all but limitless. They had a standing army of like 700,000 troops. They had another 2 million men of military age that were not yet in the army. They had 120,000 men reaching the military age of 17 every year during the war. So they had more bodies than we could kill, to put it bluntly. And yet,
kill one and two shall appear. Kill one and two more shall appear.
Yeah, exactly. So this idea that we could dissuade them by casualties, you would have had to like kill far more of them than we did. And that was the other thing. Something like 90% of search and destroy operations in South Vietnam did not find the enemy, right? So we only made contact with the enemy 5 to 10% of the time. And so like we weren't killing nearly enough of them to reach this mythical crossover point when we'd be killing more of them than they could send into South Vietnam to replace the casualties.
Now, we should probably have this justice by the start, but I try to just remember this. And there's attached to this whole Vietnam War, from what I understand from your book, is that the war never really had to be fought in the first place, because it was just a way for the president and the Americans to not appear weak in front of the rest of the world, that they had not fought the war and had they made peace immediately, from what I understand, this would have made them look weak, so they kind of felt they had to fight this war too. Of course, I think that's rather, of course, from our point of view today, it's ridiculous, but that's how the presidency, so that's how the government, American government, felt. At least they kind of had to fight this war because they would appear weak to the rest of the world if they didn't.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not that far-fetched to imagine, because as recently as 2001, the leader of the Democrats in the Senate, he spoke out against, in 2003, he spoke out against George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq, and this was the leader of the Senate Democrats, and from South Dakota, and he was beaten in the next election by an upstart congressman who's now the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune. John Thune was just like a little congressman in South Dakota. And but because the Democratic leader said that this is a stupid war in Iraq, it's not for any good reason, it doesn't fulfill any American strategic interest, he was defeated. And you know what? He was right, because it was a stupid war and it didn't fulfill any strategic interest. In fact, it was bad for America. But this is how politics is played in the American Republic, right? There's periodic scares. And everybody like lines up behind the aggressive patriotic movement that's going to fight the war, that's going to secure the country until it doesn't, right? So this was one of those. There'd been the Red Scare in the 1950s when you'd had the McCarthy hearings, and all these politicians, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon. They all were either involved or had like very intimate memories of the House Un-American Affairs Committee and the Senate investigations of all the old China hands and anybody involved in the loss of China, right? And how they were hunting for communists throughout the government, and they found a lot of them, like Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers and people like that. But
there was also a lot of witch hunting, though, and false accusations as well. Most of them, from what I remember.
There was what?
There was a lot of witch hunting as well, like false accusations and false people being sentenced falsely by these
Absolutely.
trials.
No. I mean, I'd say like more careers were ruined unjustifiably than justifiably. That's for sure. I mean, that was, but the point is that when Vietnam was kind of heating up in the early 1960s, and certainly when Eisenhower was bankrolling the French in the late 1950s, this war was fought in the shadow of those McCarthy hearings, right? And then in the early 1960s, McCarthy was gone, but politicians on the right, like Goldwater and Reagan and Nixon, were talking about how the Democrats were weak on national security and that they had to go in and they had to win this war and they had to stop the spread of communism. And polling supported that view. So that's why someone like John F. Kennedy, someone like Lyndon Johnson, like they weren't going to pull out of Vietnam. The difference was that Kennedy saw thought this was a really dumb war, and he didn't think that Southeast Asia or he didn't think that South Vietnam justified this kind of an investment of American material and money and manpower. So he was trying to kind of string it out until after the 64 elections, and then he would try to kind of extricate the United States. Whereas Johnson saw this as an opportunity to go in and, as he put it, nail the coonskins to the wall, just take America's massive might and pulverize this relatively small, weak communist country. But it had enormous manpower resources. It had great power patrons in the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China who were funneling it all the weapons and material that it needed, and so it just kept going.
So let's talk
all of which was predictable, by the way, and then but they just didn't read the tea leaves.
So let's talk about the cost of the war and because as I remember, I believe that they set the cost of the war. I don't remember who, but I believe they said it would cost something like $2 billion a year. But of course, it would cost a lot more than a $2 billion, and a $2 billion is a lot for if you don't have $2 billion. But it's almost nothing compared to what the actual cost would be to run the Vietnam War.
Yeah, well, the cost was prohibitive. The cost is what drove the United States out. That's another. People who argue we could have won the Vietnam War, I always say with what money? Because Lyndon Johnson tried to undertake the war in Vietnam alongside the Great Society. Great Society was a government program creating entitlements in medical care, the Medicare and Medicaid programs, but also huge investments in what was called the War on Poverty, alleviating poverty in the inner cities, but also rural areas like Appalachia, and then beautification, like all the parkways and highways in America were cleaned up and beautified with planting of trees, and parks were created all over the country. And there were mortgage subsidies for families. There were student loan subsidies for people who wanted to go to college. All this was part of the Great Society. There were,
I believe this would have been called Marxism. How people tried this today by the far right.
Well, I mean, the far right didn't like the Great Society at all. Great Society was a bigger program than FDR's New Deal. That's how expensive it was. It was like $11 billion a year in $1965, right? So that's a lot of dollars. It's even more dollars in $2025, right? It's a huge program. Well, Vietnam was costing at the low end 11, but by 1967, 68, $20 billion a year in 1967 dollars, right?
Let that sink in for a moment.
Yeah. So twice, Vietnam in 1 year is costing twice cost of the Great Society. And so Great Society was seen as being like a budget breaker, right? So what happened to the United States economy because of the Vietnam War was inflation doubled in the mid 1960s, and then it doubled again by 1970, right? So you had enormous problem inflation. You had an expanding debt and deficit problem. You had a run on the dollar as we were still pegged to gold. So foreign people who held American treasuries were coming in and demanding gold. So all our bullion was going abroad. So that's one reason Nixon unpegged the dollar in 1971, took us off the gold standard, and devalued the dollar because of the financial shocks of the Vietnam War. So there was no money, and Congress was waking up to this fact, and they were saying we can't do both. So in 1968, Congress and Johnson passed a 10% surtax on incomes, corporate and personal incomes, to pay for the Vietnam War, which was not popular. As the Secretary of State Dean Rusk said, that measure alone created a lot of new doves in the United States. So financially, there was no way to ratchet up this war. We were tapped out as it was, and then there was and that kind of ramified all across the government. So inside the Defense Department, there was no way to find more forces. People always say, "Oh, we should have put more forces in." There were not new forces. 2/3 of the active duty strength of the Army and Marine Corps was in South Vietnam. The rest of it was in places like NATO that were strategically far more important, and Korea and Japan. And these garrisons could not be increased because of all this stuff that was going to South Vietnam. And we could not reinforce or re-equip any of those forces. So, for example, all through the war in Vietnam, American forces in Korea had old rifles. They didn't have M16 rifles because all the M16 rifles were being given to U.S. forces in Vietnam and the South Vietnamese military and militia forces.
But were the M16 rifles incompetent, from what I remember? Like some of them would not fire at all. Some people were being killed trying to fire from the M16 rifle.
Well, I mean, the M16 rifle was a brilliant design, but it was not well suited to the jungle conditions. So that's why it had a problem with jamming, and in a way that the AK-47 didn't. But anyway, to the larger point, there was no way to really escalate this war because there was no money for it, and there were no troops for it, because the whole active duty strength pretty much was committed to South Vietnam, and everything else was already committed, and there was only one reserve division in the entire U.S. military, and that was in the United States, that could have gone anywhere in the event of a crisis. And so when the Pentagon and the Senate Armed Services Committee ran scenarios like, what if another contingency breaks out somewhere else, they realized that we didn't have force for anything other than what we were doing in Vietnam. And then when they kind of looked at the value of Vietnam as a strategic operation, they were like, the game is not worth the candle. It's like, we need to be putting our eggs in a different basket, not this one.
So let's talk about popular feelings, because like you said in the beginning, it was the first war that kind of was brought home to the living room of the American people. So what was the popular, and of course the hippie movement is famously known to be an anti-Vietnam War, and so let's talk about the protests and the American feeling towards the war from both the early until the later stages of the war, because it's, of course, a lot of movies, and Forrest Gump and Hair, for example, one of the are some MASH, the TV series, there are some of those that kind of help to be anti-war, anti-Vietnam, or most of them are, as even Star Wars, I'll come back to that, is kind of anti-Vietnam product. So let's talk about how the anti-Vietnam feeling were built up over time.
Okay, and then I got about 10 more minutes, so let's. Okay, polling. The war was initially very popular. Americans, they accepted the argument that this was a war of containment against the spread of communism. that we had to halt the spread of communism that was being pushed forward not only by the Soviet Union but now by this new communist power of China, that was deeply enmeshed in the politics of Southeast Asia. So we had to hold the line. So you saw polling 80% or more of Americans supporting it at the outset, but those numbers come down. They come down as the cost, the casualties, the futility of the war become apparent. The futility is, I think, the most striking thing. Something observed by all these. This was the maybe the only war in American history where journalists could go anywhere. They were not embedded officially. They were not put in a press pool. There was a press pool in Saigon and in the other South Vietnamese cities where there'd be MACV briefings, right? But like if you could get a ride on a truck or a helicopter, you could go into the combat zone and shoot footage and interview troops and officers and stuff there and observe the fighting.
Were there restrictions for a journalist what they could and could not write? I mean, you had the TV cameras as well, but so you could see, like as we said, you could see on the television. But were the censorship around the journalists?
There's very little. They're not supposed to show dead Americans. That's about the extent of it. So people are getting a very unvarnished view of the war, but also there's a sense of futility, the sense that we're fighting for places that the enemy does not really defend other than to just kill Americans and then scuttle away. And so we're fighting for some hill. We take it with heavy casualties, and there's no enemy there because they've withdrawn. And their whole goal is just to lure us onto these killing fields and kill us to kind of stretch us thin and demoralize us. So this sense of futility builds, and by the sort of nature of the war, by the footage that we see at home of the fighting, by the reports filed by correspondents that detail the lies of the military leadership in Vietnam and the lies of the political leadership in Washington about this war. Because remember, from Eisenhower on, there's this whole idea that you have to muddy the details of this war as much as possible, because if the people are made aware of the exact nature of it, they won't support it. So you keep it very vague. But people begin to realize that we're just sort of pushing this heavy stone uphill, and we're never even getting close to the top. And then the cost of the war, the cost in blood. I mean, the 200 American dead every month in 1968, 150,000 Americans killed and wounded in Vietnam in 1968 alone. Right? That's a lot. That's a lot of people killed and wounded in a single year. So this kind of begins to wear on Americans. Then the cost of the war, the inflation. Like I said, doubles in the mid 60s, doubles again in 1970. So everything's getting more expensive. Credit's getting squeezed. And government programs are getting cut. Taxes are being raised to pay for this war. A war that everybody's like, well, it doesn't even benefit me. Then you have the rising insurgency of the media and campus protests. And
of course the famous hippie movement as well.
The which?
The hippie movement, the famous hippie movement that started to rise in the late 60s.
The which movement?
The hippie movement.
Oh, the hippies. Yeah, the hippies. Yeah. The hippies. Well, but the thing is that's a myth of the Vietnam War is that most Americans, sympathize or whatever. Of course, they didn't. The hippies were extremely unpopular, broadly speaking. Like a vast majority of Americans despise the hippies, despise the peace movement. But that didn't detract from the power of these campus protests, these large-scale campus protests, allied with these big peace rallies, marches on Washington, the moratorium marches in 1970 against the war. And then the outpouring of scorn from the media, where they really detailed in really like forensic detail the failings of this war, the strategic and operational failings of this war. Not only the inability to find and defeat the enemy, but the fact that we were making the situation worse inside South Vietnam. We're supposedly fighting a war to kind of prop up the people of South Vietnam against this communist menace, and we were killing at least 500,000 South Vietnamese civilians in this war, in these indiscriminate airstrikes and these artillery barrages on villages trying to like push out the Viet Cong. So we're killing the very people we're trying to support. We're burning down their villages. We're basically we're defoliating a fifth, 20% of the South Vietnamese landmass with Agent Orange, and we're creating an enormous refugee problem inside South Vietnam, and we're calling it victory. And so the American public gets wise to this
Again,
after a while.
like you said earlier, there was a body count that counted. It didn't matter if it was civilian or Vietcong. What matters was the body count. It didn't matter who they were killing.
Yeah, if they're dead and they're Vietnamese, they're VC. That was the guidance. So you would count all civilian when you think about something like the My Lai massacre in 1968. Hundreds of civilians in My Lai and My Kay, the neighboring hamlet. Hundreds of civilians gunned down. Babies, infants, women, old men. Not a young man among them, right? And all counted as Viet Cong until it was exposed. And probably the number was never correct because that was standard practice. Every dead body was a VC because that's how you, if you were an Army officer or a Marine officer, that's how you improved your performance report, by having high body counts. It was a completely corrupt system, which led to really savage abuses, and in terms of military utility, it basically eroded the mission, and it made a U.S. victory, which was remote at the best of times, all but impossible.
Now we're going to end very soon, but we have to talk about the road to peace, because already in 1968, I believe, they began talking about leaving Vietnam and trying to get troops out of Vietnam. But of course, it was presidential election very soon, and one of the candidates were Richard Nixon, and I shouldn't be shocked by this, but because he, of course, and Kissinger tried to actively sabotage peace talks around the time to win the election and be the heroes of Vietnam, and of course, they succeeded in sabotaging the peace talks, and like you say in the book, do you think they would have been successful had not Nixon and Kissinger actively sabotaged the peace talks?
Well, that we can't know. We can't know that. What I argue in the book is that what we do know is that Lyndon Johnson had sent Averell Harriman over to Paris, and Lyndon Johnson had ordered a bombing halt as a precondition for talks. And with the bombing halt, the North Vietnamese sent their delegation, and they were deep into negotiations. And one of the people that was attached to Averell Harriman's delegation in Paris was a Harvard professor named Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger had been a foreign policy advisor to Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York, who was also running for president. And then Nixon had basically beat Rockefeller, so Kissinger was the odd man out. And so he didn't really have a patron in the Republican Party. So he wants to cozy up. He doesn't want to join the Democrats. He wants to be a Republican, but he needs to get in Nixon's good graces. So he reaches out to the Nixon team surreptitiously, and he says, "Hey, I'm embedded in the peace delegation in Paris with the Johnson administration. I can tell you guys what's going on, and I can help you subvert these peace talks that are moving ahead." And in one of his messages, Kissinger says, "They're so certain of peace." This is in October of 1968, or September, October 1968. "They're so certain of peace, they're already chilling the champagne." So Nixon's alarmed because he realizes that he's ahead of Humphrey in the polls. But if a peace deal is announced, the public will swing back to the Democrats and elect Humphrey, and he'll be out of luck. So he activates Kissinger as his agent. Kissinger feeds him all this information. And then based on the information provided by Kissinger about how close they are to a deal in Paris, the Nixon team reaches out to the South Vietnamese embassy through a cutout. Anna Chennault, who was the widow of Claire Chennault, the guy who ran the Flying Tigers operation in China during World War II. She's a stalwart of the China lobby. So she's the sort of cutout who goes to the South Vietnamese embassy and brokers this thing. The South Vietnamese embassy then reaches out to President Chiu. Chiu says, okay, and the message Chiu gets from Nixon is do not go to Paris, do not agree to the Johnson peace. When Nixon wins, he's going to get you a better deal. So Chiu
Of course
says,
he doesn't.
So no, Johnson could have just stuck to his guns and said, okay, Chiu. He could have done, because basically the deal that Chiu is going to get in 1973, 5 years later, it's the exact same deal that he was about to get from LBJ. And Nixon said, don't do it. I'll get you a better deal. Nixon gives him the same deal. And then
So it's like a certain precedent.
That's the same deal. And then Nixon says, okay, well, then you're done.
That sounds
Johnson-
like a certain precedent of today that has been Geoff.
Yeah, it does. It does. But very different. These guys were a lot smarter. But so Johnson is just, Johnson just sort of gives up, and because he's a broken man. The war has broken him, has broken his presidency. So he just walks away. Nixon wins, comes in, claims he has a secret plan to win the war quickly. Of course, there's no secret plan. And the war kind of limps along in much the same vein for another 4.5 years, and then finally kind of peters out at these so-called peace accords in January 73. Had the war ended in November 68 with Johnson's peace plan, there would have been 30,000 American dead. Instead, it ends in January 73 with Nixon's peace plan, which is exactly the same as Johnson's peace plan, with 58,000 American dead. So the war goes on another 4+ years, and there's another 28,000 killed, and tens and thousands more wounded, many horribly with life-altering wounds, for the exact same deal. It's one of the most scurrilous chapters in American history. That's very little known to Americans.
So I'm going to ask this question before we go. What are your thoughts that in Star Wars, that I said earlier, that the Rebel Alliance is supposed to be this Vietcong? Do you see the parallel, and do you think what do you think about the George Lucas saying that the Rebel Alliance is the Vietcong?
The Rebel Alliance in which country?
Star Wars, in the movie series Star Wars.
Oh,
the Rebel Alliance is supposed to be.
I'm one of the rare people
Vietcong.
that never saw the movie Star Wars.
Really? I thought you would have known.
even though I was alive when I was in my teenage prime when it came out, but I never saw it. I couldn't answer that.
You should definitely give it a go. But another question though: do you have a favorite Vietnam movie? And why is it Forrest Gump?
Easily my favorite would be Apocalypse Now, and Apocalypse Now Redux. That's even better because it has a lot of uncut, scenes that were cut from the original that are put back in for Redux. That one's great. And then Platoon. I mean, you can't beat those two. Those are the best, in my opinion.
Josie Janchot MASH, sort of, even though it's set in Korea, is kind of a Vietnam series in a way, because it was kind of an answer to the commentary on Vietnam at the time. So just that it's a bit gray area, but just that kind of front, I just suppose.
I mean, but
MASH, the series. So
yeah,
the doctors.
I love MASH. I remember watching MASH as a kid. That was great, but different kind of show. It's funny.
But it also was a comment on Vietnam, from what I understand, at the time, even though it's set in Korea.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I feel like that might have gone over my head, given how old I was when I watched it. I just thought it was funny, and there was there was nothing funny about Vietnam. That's the problem. You couldn't have made a show like MASH about Vietnam. And just starting with the wounds, the wounds in Vietnam, so many were inflicted by these horrible booby traps made with recycled American ordnance for the most part. And you don't have that issue in Korea. You have horrible wounding from bullets and shells, but you don't have the same booby trap problem. And so there was just nothing funny. It was so tragic. It was orders of magnitude more tragic than Korea, or so it seemed.
I think we done round it up to actually easily talk another hour about this sport because
Easily.
it's over 500 pages long and it's quite big. But we only touched the tip of the iceberg. So before you go, of course, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to have you on. Where can people, of course, buy your book, Vietnam, a military history? And of course, if people have further questions, where can they find you on social media or email or links you wanted to share in the description below? Now is a chance to share where if people have further questions or want to follow you anywhere else.
Oh, just on X at Jeff Wawro. That'd be the best place to find me. And then you get the book on Amazon or wherever you buy books. It's been doing very well. Sold a lot of copies. It's been widely reviewed, and consistently hailed as maybe the best single volume history and overview of the war, and well written.
Indeed. Thank you again so much for coming on. This has been a great pleasure. My name is Alan. This has been That Age 12. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you're on Spotify, consider give us 5 stars if you like this episode. Also, check out some other episodes. We did like I said in the beginning, we did another episode on Vietnam with Mark Lawrence, who is a colleague of Geoffrey. We have also other episodes are coming out that you should definitely check out. There's some exciting stuff on the way. We are available on social media on that as well on Instagram, Blue Sky, and Twitter, all the same. So take a look at us there. We always try to share the weekly episodes on our social media as well, so you never miss one episode. On YouTube, if you are on YouTube, like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment. You can also leave a comment under episodes on Spotify. So tell me what you think about the Vietnam War and what we discussed in this episode. That would be great. If you are on Apple Podcasts, consider give us a review. That would be very nice. And like I said, check out some other episodes. Like, share, and subscribe. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.